Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Marissa Howard. I'm the Programs and Membership Coordinator for the DeKalb History Center. If this is your first time here, I welcome you to the DeKalb History Center, where we've been preserving and maintaining DeKalb County's history since 1947. So I'll keep this brief because I think we have a lot to learn tonight. But I just want to welcome Dr. Craig to talk about his travels through Egypt. So thank you very much for coming.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Egypt? Anybody? A couple? Oh, that's what brings you here. Very good. How many plan to go? Very good. Well, we'll see if that increases by the end of the night. So, I want to start just sort of informally with an extraordinary sort of serendipitous experience that was involved at the beginning of this trip that I took at the very end of 2023, I guess it was. This was a Viking river cruise, which is a very good way to go. It happened that our guide throughout the whole Nile River cruise had a master's degree in Egyptology, so she really knew her stuff, and it was really very good. Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
Let me turn this off so I don't do the dastardly deed. But the tour started in Cairo and had a couple of days to be looking at Cairo sites, and that was by bus before we flew to Luxor to start the river cruise. The first day, I, of course, flown all the way from Atlanta to Cairo, and I thought I was at the other end of the world. We're heading off to the Egyptian Museum, and I overhear this conversation behind me, in the seat behind me, talking to the person across the aisle. And the person across the aisle says to the one behind me, "Oh, I see you have a Georgia Tech hat on." I thought Georgia Tech was an engineering school. What are you doing on this cruise and study tour of ancient Egyptian monuments? And the man says, "Well, yes, I did go to Georgia Tech, and it is an engineering school, but I'm an architect. I was in the architecture school. And years ago, I had this young professor named Robert Craig who gave a course and a series of lectures on the history of architecture, and I became a buff of history. And so I let him say a few more nice things about me, and then I turned around and said, that would be me." So the whole bus that was within hearing aid sort of jaws collectively dropped, and they thought this couldn't happen, but it was. And so we spent the next touring with these friends that we renewed student. We calculated that he must have been in my class probably in 1975, maybe 76, somewhere in there. He is an architect who lives in Peachtree City and was going to come tonight, and the last minute could not. He just, his wife emailed me about an hour ago and said, oh, they had planned to come and just could not. We also had originally scheduled this for January, and then we had an ice and sleet event that sort of scared everybody off. And the January date was set because another couple from Sarasota, Florida had planned to come up from Sarasota to hear the lecture. We had met them in Russia on a Russia tour many years ago, and they had wanted to do another tour that we could coordinate. And at the very last minute, they were able to join the tour that we took because people were a little concerned that the Israeli conflict was going to make Egypt dangerous, and so they canceled out. And so at the very last minute, some space came about. And so halfway through that tour, we were chatting with them, and they said, did you sign up for the Abu Simbel extra cost tour at the very end? And I said, well, you know, we should have, we didn't. And she says, neither did we. He says it's like $1,000 a couple extra to go on this one day because of the way they had to fly, bus, you know, variety of ways to get down there. So we sort of lamented that, and then they said, well, do you want to come with us? We've just hired a limousine, and it'll cost us $95 each if the four of us share it. So we hopped aboard, and we drove across about 2.5 hours of desert to get where we were going, had all the time we wanted. We saw people from our ship that were there when we got there. and then came back, had a wonderful day. So we went the cheap route, but it was wonderful. So you'll get a bit of that in the second piece of this. This is in two parts, and I hope that you brought some snacks or something to keep you going, but I hope it won't seem like too arduously long. But there's a lot to cover, and it's, I hope, very interesting to you. It's called In the Footsteps of David Roberts. It relies a lot on David Roberts, a painter, and his journal from his own visit to some of the same sites in 1838. So let me begin. If I can get this to change over. On November 5th, 1838, Scottish painter David Roberts was elected an associate member of the Royal Academy. He was not at the time in London, but had already embarked on the journey that would make his name world famous. During the late 19th century and continuing today, his renown is based on his activity as a recorder of ancient monuments and burial sites, as well as of street views, mosques, and other religious sites in the Near East. Typical is his oil on canvas, which we see on the right side, a view of Cairo, reproduced as well as a lithograph and depicting the Zuwali gate and minarets of the Red Mosque behind. The painting is signed and it's dated 1840, and it was purchased by Queen Victoria from the Royal Academy exhibit of that year. Robert's journal of December 28, 1838, records his on-site sketching of the scene in the Egyptian capital, and I'll quote it. Today I made 2 drawings of the Bab Zuwali gate with its minarets. I am still bewildered by the extraordinarily picturesque appearance of the streets and buildings of this most wonderful of cities, unquote. Well, when Roberts returned from his 11-month trip to Egypt and the Holy Land, he was elected a full Royal Academician in 1840 and continued to be an exhibitor at the Royal Academy every year from 1840 to 1864. Today, Roberts is best known for his publication in monthly parts between 1842 and 1849 of portfolios of lithographs entitled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land, publishing the more fully rendered views based on his on-site drawings and sketches and studies made during the trip. The Egyptian part of his tour took him from Alexandria and Cairo to Abu Simbel, stopping at the pyramids and Sphinx at Giza, Dendera, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, Luxor, Karnak, Edfu, the island of Philae, and other ancient Egyptian sites of major archaeological and architectural historical significance. He measured the buildings, he kept a journal, he filled sketchbooks, painted watercolors, executed drawings, and made oil studies, documenting the state of preservation of ancient Egyptian and Ptolemaic monuments, recording their condition as of the mid-19th century, over 3,000 years after the columns and pylons had been raised by the pharaohs. Upon his return to London, Roberts exhibited his watercolors twice in London and also in Glasgow and Edinburgh, with the intention of obtaining subscriptions for the forthcoming book of lithographs executed and published by his friend Louis Haig, and a plan to appear in monthly installments and 2 sections, the Holy Land and Egypt and Nubia. At right is the cover of the Egypt folio. Roberts redrew each watercolor so that the lithographer could work from more exact drawings, and when the drawings were exhibited, the critics and the publics raved. One critic wrote, quote, "The masterly skill and dexterity of hand with which Mr. Roberts has delineated the characteristic features of the scenery and the minutest details of the architecture, combining breadth of effect and grandeur of size with precision and neatness of outline and local color, are the theme of universal admiration. It is surprising to observe the largeness of view which takes in with a comprehensive eye the broad masses of each stupendous subject, united with the most careful exactness in delineating every hieroglyphic on the walls and the colorful pattern of each individual capital. The artist has felt the sentiment of the scenes with the mind of a poet and depicted them with the accuracy of a draftsman. And we think it will be acknowledged that the stupendous proportions of the Egyptian remains have never been adequately represented until now. Well, of course, they hadn't been because hardly anybody had been there to do it. But for us, Robert's views provided a striking lithographic record of the conditions during the mid-19th century of the best known of ancient Egyptian monuments. Some were more than half buried in sand. Giant columns were toppled over. The annual inundation of the Nile flooded whole complexes. Colossal statues and obelisks were in varied states of preservation, but each site remained a remarkable reflection of ancient Egyptian culture. It is not known how many copies of Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land were printed. Notable 19th century figures were among the just 600 subscribers, including Queen Victoria and other European royalties, the Pasha of Egypt, the Duke of Wellington, and such writers as Charles Dickens and John Ruskin. In addition to the published lithographs, Roberts completed and exhibited oil paintings, hanging 5 pictures at the Royal Academy in 1840 and 3 more the following year. As Helen Guterman has noted, quote, they were not only effective as paintings, but portrayed scenes unknown to the vast majority of critics, writers, and visitors to the exhibition. The Mediterranean trip and the art fulfilled a major ambition for Roberts. His biographer, James Ballantyne, recorded in 1866 that Roberts regarded a trip to the Near East as, quote, the dream of his life from boyhood, unquote, and the central episode of his artistic life. Roberts had traveled earlier to France, the Low Countries, Germany, Spain, and Morocco, and would travel to Italy in the 1850s, drawing and painting everywhere he went. His 1833 sojourn to Spain produced such works as the old buildings of the Darro in Granada on the left side of the screen and the gates of Viva Rambla, Granada on the right, both dated 1834. Having lost its picturesque surrounds, the Viva Rambla at the bottom right, and his painting is above it, the gate stands in ruin today in a Granada part. Roberts likely visited museums to look at other artists' works. For instance, his somewhat sentimental picture, The Fountain in the Prado, Madrid, recalls the figural poses in a palette of Watteau. It was painted in 1841 for Queen Victoria as a Christmas gift to Prince Albert. Some of Roberts' works were sweeping panoramas, recalling that his earliest artistic experience was as a scenery painter for a traveling theater in Scotland. Then in 1819, he became the official painter of the Théâtre Royal of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and in 1821 he was painting for the Drury Lane Theatre in London and then for Covent Garden. He became internationally known following his scenes for the staging of Mozart's The Abduction from the Seraglio. And when one of his views of Rouen Cathedral was exhibited at the Royal Academy, quote, his art began to gain wide critical success, unquote. A favorite of Queen Victoria, who bought numerous of his pictures, Roberts was commissioned more than once by the Queen to paint a picture for her to give as a gift to Prince Albert, the most famous of which is probably Roberts' 34 inches high by 5 feet wide oil canvas on canvas entitled The Opening of the Great Exhibition. This is a very frequently published photograph of the First World's Fair. The painting dates 1852, and it was exhibited the following year at the Royal Academy and gifted to Prince Albert. It was celebrating Prince Albert's leadership in sponsoring the First World's Fair held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in London in 1851. Now, beyond these scenic and documentary pictures, David Roberts' views of antiquity, published in Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land, are the artistic images by which he's best known today. They offer a notable record of the condition of the monuments some 83 years before Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon's famous discovery of King Tut's tomb, and of course thousands of years after the monuments were first conceived and erected. In 2023, I had the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of David Roberts, 185 years after his expedition, recording many of the same monuments from the same vantage point and documenting by camera various temples that since Roberts' day had been cleared of sand and that still retained surface reliefs and painted scenes and hieroglyphs from 3 millennia ago. Some entire sites, such as the temple complex of Isis on the island of Philae and colossal monuments at Abu Simbel, have been dismantled, moved, and reassembled since Roberts' day. Moreover, what I could do, which Roberts could not, was climb down into King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, 101 years after Howard Carter's momentous discovery, but a burial chamber, of course, unknown in Roberts' day. As some of my fellow travelers observed, this was not a vacation trip, but hard work, educational, arduous, and sometimes painful. If author Fabio Bourbon would characterize David Roberts at age 42 as an artist devoted to adventure, perhaps I, at age 79, might be called an overzealous architectural historian, sometimes too anxious to photograph the next great world landmark. Well, I'm thankful for the help getting around various funerary and temple sites during my own adventures in Egypt after my knees gave out. But as my British wife would say, keep calm and carry on. I first learned of Roberts' lithographs several decades ago when I was researching the Fox Theater in Atlanta, an Egyptian Islamic revival atmospheric movie palace of 1929 built as the Yarab Temple of the Mystic Shrine. Earlier in the 1920s, Atlanta Shriners had traveled to the Holy Land, and images of mosques clearly informed the design of the Yarab Temple turned movie palace, while its Egyptian features in 1929 were part of a national Egyptomania following Carter's 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. While I thumbed through Roberts' lithographic prints in the early 1990s in preparation for a book I was doing on the Art Deco era of Atlanta, I could not imagine that 30 years later I would find myself in the footsteps of David Roberts, cruising the Nile by boat with daily excursions to the sites that Robert had recorded in the late 1830s. In August 1838, Roberts departed from London on his journey to the Near East, traveling through France to Marseille, where he boarded a steamer to Malta, took another steamer to the Aegean, and finally joined a crowd of Turkish pilgrims on their way to Mecca for Roberts' final sea leg to Alexandria. He hired a servant, ordered provisions, and began his sketches. When he reached Cairo 2 days later, he secured a houseboat for £15 a month, a vessel that he first sank in the Nile to get rid of the rats, a task that I did not need to perform when I boarded the Osiris on the bottom left for my Nile trip in December 2023, bound for the same sites that Roberts visited and recorded. It was the same time of year. Most of Roberts' sketches in Cairo were done in the month of December. When he returned to the city at the end of October, at the end of his October through December Nile trip, just before he set off for the Holy Land in early 1939, his journal of September through December 1839 recorded the Egyptian sites he visited, many of which I toured in 2023 in the footsteps of the 19th century artists. On September 30th, Roberts records that he, quote, slept very little last night, being tormented with all the plagues of Egypt combined, but that at about 11:30, we first caught glimpse of the pyramids. Roberts' reaction to the Giza monuments paralleled countless other observers throughout the centuries. He wrote, quote, what sensations rush upon us at first sight of these stupendous monuments of past ages, the mystery in which they have ever been enveloped, the very object of their erection wrapped in oblivion. What were the stupendous works of Roman art compared to these, unquote. And when he returned to the pyramids on October 3rd, he wrote in his journal, quote, I was not so much struck with the enormous dimension of the Great Pyramid until I began to ascend it, which is an awful task, unquote. And then he added that the Sphinx actually pleased me even more than the pyramids, unquote. His January 17th, 1839 painting of the arrival of the Simoon in Giza, that Simoon is a dry sandstorm. You can see it blustering up on the left side of that painting, is among the most dramatic of his images and certainly striking in color. But in the history of Egyptian architecture, the stepped pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, located 15 miles southwest of Cairo, is considered the oldest stone building of significance in Egypt, dating to the Old Kingdom, circa 2670, 2650 BC. Just to remind you, that means that was as many years before Christ Jesus that we are after Christ Jesus. So it's that long ago, and thus the first great ancient monument of my own travels to Egypt. I remarked concerning the monument's age that there were 600 years more moving back and separating this monument from the birth of Christ than moving forward to 2023 and separating the birth of Christianity from my own day. The pyramid was 4,700 years old. The step pyramid was built for Djoser, the second king of the third dynasty, and its architect Imhotep is considered the world's first named architect. The 205-foot, six-tiered pyramid, generally oriented to the cardinal points, could be seen from Djoser's capital at Memphis, about 2.6 miles away. The open desert, Djoser's pyramid, dominated the skyline, and moreover, from the air, as we flew over it, something obviously David Roberts couldn't do, I could experience the scale of the full complex as Roberts could not. Beneath the pyramid was a complex of galleries and some 400 rooms, and I recall reading some 6 decades ago that court officials had built lesser tombs known as mastabas at the edge of the complex. They would provide my first view of ancient hieroglyphs and relief wall paintings. The whole site of Saqqara, indeed, was a vast necropolis, and at its northern end, archaeologists had excavated stone mastabas and large mud brick tombs of even earlier date than Djoser's pyramid. Storage jars with the names of kings of the first dynasty from 2925 BC were found in the mastabas. But these tombs were not for pharaohs, but were for high officials of the court. I toured the mastaba tomb of Ragji-Ni, who was a chief justice and vizier during the reign of Teti of the 6th dynasty. The wall paintings and reliefs were remarkable in their preserved color, considering their 4,350-year age. Typical subjects and Egyptian styling showed a court official, for instance, at right with Sekhem, the scepter of power in his left hand and a long cane of office in his right hand. Scenes of daily life included milking a cow in the bottom left, carrying a calf on your shoulders in the center, and at the top left, symbols including a row of cobras and dogs, the latter canine depicted as sometimes something between a jackal and a wolf, and the symbol of Anubis, one of the principal gods of the dead. Old Kingdom reliefs typically showed terrestrial activities rather than the afterlife or depictions of gods. So Jimny's walls depict hunting, fishing, his livestock, plentiful fields, and abundant goods enjoyed on the earth. The details are especially striking: a butterfly, a papyrus and lotus plant, herds of cattle, a frog, a grasshopper, a dragonfly, and various species of fish. Interestingly, this tomb was discovered in 1843, 5 years after David Roberts' Egyptian expedition, but it appears from his portfolio of lithographs that Roberts bypassed the step pyramid of Djoser altogether. One plate in his group of lithographs from December 20th provides a distant view from the Nile to the pyramids of Dashur, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid. These are not far from Saqqara, but there appears not to be any indication that he went to Saqqara. The December date of this view of Dashur indicates Roberts was documenting his boats passing the area on his return from Upper Egypt, and thus the end of his Egyptian phase of his Near East expedition. He records having first passed the pyramids en route up the Nile, that is southward, on October 7th, commenting, quote, "I was stung to death last night with the mosquitoes, could not bear the net owing to the closeness of the cabin, and so paid the price," unquote. Well, after dinner that evening, he writes, "I went to bed with my hands burning with the bites of not only the mosquitoes, but I think of the large ants which are everywhere." 11 days later, on October 18th, he records more happily, quote, "We are now drawing near Dendera, the most beautiful of all the Egyptian temples, and I shall soon see whether all my hopes are to be realized." The portico and the temple of Hathor at Dendera were half buried in sand when Robert saw them at dawn on October 19th, 1838, although he noted, quote, "Sufficient remains to restore in drawing nearly the whole." He spent the whole making measurements and recording his first impressions. Quote, "I was struck with the amazement, first at the preservation in which I found every part, and secondly, with the endless labor bestowed upon the carvings. For here every part is literally covered with hieroglyphics from top to bottom and from roof to roof, outside as well as inside, from figures raised 15 feet in height to those so small that they have to be examined with a glass. This must have been the work of ages," unquote. He took time to draw the temple and what was labeled as the so-called Typhorium, which I think must be the Mamisi, or the birth house, built by Augustus at the left on the drawing and in my photograph 185 years later. Roberts continued on his journey south to Karnak, leaving until December 6th through 8th, 1838, and having a return trip to Dendera on the way back to Cairo, the drawings that would be the basis of Haig's lithographs. They show sand covering more than half the east gate, or portico, near to the lintel. The temple itself is substantially encroached by a sand hill at left, and in his watercolor, there appears to be substantial sand even on the rooftop of the temple, where a terraced roof temple is there, treated as a small kiosk and dedicated Isis. That survives in the southwest corner on the roof of the temple. Photograph is mine on the right, the sand-swept roof is his drawing on the left. Here in the so-called Iridation Chapel, the sacred image would be brought rooftop from the naos of the temple below and exposed to the sunlight to be regenerated. Noteworthy features of the temple are the massive columns in 3 rows in the hypostyle hall, making up a temple building 139 feet wide by 60 feet deep. The capitals each display the face of Hathor, the goddess to whom the temple is dedicated. In his drawing, Roberts left the capital faces blank, as you can see on the left, inasmuch as most of them had been defaced by iconoclastic Coptic Christian monks when the temple was converted to a church. The unmolested capital on the top right in my photograph was in the temple grounds when I visited in December 2023, but the conditions of most in situ remain as shown on the bottom right. Photographs taken 185 years after Robert's few days in Dendera give evidence of the accuracy of his various drawings and lithographs ultimately published in his Egypt, Syria, and Holy Land portfolios. The drawings are elegant, detailed, and colorful, and the artist in various media was able to capture the essential qualities of the monuments. At Dendera, Roberts remarked in the words of Fabio Bourbon that, quote, "the perfect balance between solid and hollow effect and minute details of rich ornamentation are some of the features that make it an architectural miracle," unquote. And every surface is ornamented with hieroglyphs, symbols, and colorful imagery. And today, with the sand removed and Egypt's eternal sunshine, it survives in its nearly original splendor. When Roberts returned to London, the Dendera temple was one of the subjects he treated in a large oil on canvas painting executed in 1841 and now in the Bristol City Art Museum in England. In this epic work, he reinstates the face of the goddess Hathor. For David Roberts in 1838, the ancient city of Thebes, which today is the modern city of Luxor, became the center for branching out to tour the landscape and tombs of the Valley of the Kings, and to look at the Ramesseum with its toppled over colossus of Ramses II. The top right-hand little inset is a photograph that I took of this site as we flew by in the bus. We didn't stop to look at any of this, but it turned out to be almost exactly the vantage point of his drawing. What is in the middle is the toppled, it's hard to depict, but it's the toppled over colossus of Ramses. You're looking at his head and shoulders, and then several of the piers alongside. He also, during that trip, looked at the Colossi of Memnon that once flanked the entrance to the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III of the 18th century, and in Robert's day was frequently flooded, as you can see in his painting, by the annual inundation of the Nile. And in the Valley of the Queens, the mortuary temple complex of Queen Hatshepsut, whose excavations really didn't get underway until the 1850s to the 1870s, that is, after Robert's expedition. So he could not have seen that, but we were able to visit it in the Valley of the Queens. However, Luxor itself contains two major temple complexes visited by Roberts and considered among the most significant architectural monuments of ancient Egypt: the monumental temple of Karnak and the temple of Luxor that rivals it. Roberts recorded his visits to the Luxor temple on October 23, 1838, drawing a picturesque view of the temple from the Nile, sort of two views of that on the top and my photographs on the bottom, and recording in his journal, quote, "This morning I walked over the vast remains of this mighty edifice. It is buried with the mud houses of a modern town," unquote. The great pylon, tolerably preserved, is half buried, and the two obelisks, which were at the entrance, only one of them remains. The other one is in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. The Luxor obelisks, and you can see them in his paintings and in a night photograph I took at the bottom left with only the one surviving that would have been paired on the other side of that entry. But the Luxor obelisks, which the French had eyed since Napoleon's conquests, were officially donated to France by Muhammad Ali Pasha, and then he was then the current ruler of Ottoman Egypt. Following encouragement by Jean-Francois Champollion, renowned, the latter, Jean-Francois, renowned for his decipherment of the Rosetta Stone. The shorter obelisk was taken down in 1831. It arrived in Paris in 1833, and it was erected in 1836, which means that's just 2 years before Robert's visit to Luxor. So it was not there when he was there, nor, of course, was it there when I was there. Roberts commented on the issue in his journal, expressing his hope that the second obelisk remain where it is. Both obelisks were given to Paris, by the way, given to France, writing, quote, "However interesting these may be to the antiquarian, they are out of place everywhere but surrounded by the temple which harmonizes with them," unquote. And despite the gift of both obelisks, the process of removal, transport, and re-erection of the first obelisk, 75 feet high and weighing 227 tons, was so difficult that the second obelisk remains in Luxor. And in 1981, then French President Francois Mitterrand officially renounced possession of the second Luxor obelisk, in effect giving it back to Egypt, where, like Roberts before me, I saw it in situ. In Roberts' day, sand and debris was so piled up in front of the pylons that the 50-foot-high Colossi of Ramses II was half buried in sand. Roberts drew them as he found them. Faces defaced since the time Ramses added them to the Amenhotep III's 14th century complex during Ramses' 66-year reign. One of the most impressive spaces deep in the temple is the colonnade of the court of Amenhotep III, which Roberts also found buried in sand halfway up the column shafts. In Roberts' day, the sand-filled temple was further cluttered with houses, wretched dwellings, he called them, clustered around the temple without order, twisted in and out between the pillars. This was a community of people living in the temple. The houses were cleared away in 1885. Gaston Maspero was then the director of antiquities who excavated the temple. That, of course, is after Roberts' day. But for Roberts, the contrast between the modern hovels and the monumental ancient temple made clear the grandeur of the latter, whose main pillars Roberts estimated to be 30 feet in circumference. Such dimensions, he noted in his journal, quote, may give some idea of proportions. The capitals, which are overspread in the form of a lotus, must be about 50 feet in the outer circle. Roberts had spent a brief day, October 23rd, at Luxor, on his way up the Nile, and executed his several drawings on the return trip in December, so he and I toured during the same month of the year. My evening visit on the 9th of December witnessed a dramatically lighted complex, and further views were afforded on the 10th as we sailed past the complex along the Nile. When Roberts returned to the town of Luxor in November, he investigated the grandest temple complex of them all, the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and it was likewise on my itinerary. Roberts' October visit to Karnak prompted ecstatic response as recorded in his journal. He wrote, "If Luxor struck me with its magnitude, what shall I say of Karnak? Its grandeur cannot be imagined. Were I to write what I think, it would be more rhapsodic. It is so far beyond everything I have ever seen that I can draw no comparison." The distant view across the plain fails to indicate the true magnificence, and Roberts admitted, quote, "I cannot understand Denon's account of the French army stopping in amazement and clapping their hands in ecstasy of the delight of their turning a corner of a mountain and coming in sight of it, in distant sight of it. It is only upon coming nearer," he continues, "that you are overwhelmed, as it were, with astonishment." And speaking of the great columns, Roberts noted, "You must be under them and look up and walk around them. And for this reason, I'm fearful that painting will scarcely convey any notion of what I mean." Well, modern critics of Roberts' work indicate that he need not have worried. William Peck, for instance, writes, quote, "The quality that attracts us to his work is his perfect genius for capturing the salient qualities of the scene before him. With an eye of a romantic and the hand of a master draftsman, he combined the natural beauties of exotic places with the awesome character of ancient remains and ruins. These, in turn, he combined and united with poignant vignettes of daily life," unquote. Peck comments that Roberts was, quote, "perfectly suited to satisfy the public demand, that he could also take pride in his high degree of accuracy and the fact that he was the first English architect to illustrate the remains of ancient Egypt," unquote. Well, as on his way south in October, Roberts spent the day, October 23rd, at Karnak. But when he returned in November, on his way back to Cairo, he devoted an unprecedented 3 days in the temple, drawing and sketching mostly views of the impressive hypostyle hall. In October, he recorded in detail the sequence of the features of the temple layout, much as I experienced them on December 9th, 2023. And Roberts' description is worth quoting at length. And this is from his journal, and I'm going to illustrate what he saw and as he described it. Between the pylons, the pro-pylons, is the main entrance to a spacious quadrangle in which is left one solitary column. Surrounding the whole of this is a colonnade. You can see the arrows pointing to the singularly surviving single column, but you can see there were two rows of them. And then around on the top and the bottom of that open space are smaller pillars from which branch off cloisters supported also by colossal figures with their arms crossed on their breasts and holding the scourge and crook. Crossing the court are two more pro-pylons with a gateway between them, the entrance of the great temple itself. This gateway is choked up with huge fragments of the roof, and on the right hand is a mutilated upright figure of Memnon, flanking statues identified as Ramses II. Beyond these columns are gateways seen through other gateways and obelisks in the distance, the most stupendous of the kind in existence. These pillars are 33.6 inches in circumference. I think he probably didn't mean circumference. I think he meant diameter. And on each side are rows of columns much lower, forming aisles to the hypostyle hall. Beside the greater, these pillars suffer in apparent size, but seen anywhere alone, they would be colossal. The plinths of the capitals are 3 feet 6. Everything is covered with carvings and some of the most beautiful kind. That's the end of that quote from the journal. Well, Roberts was clearly impressed by the scale of the columns of the hypostyle hall, and when he returned to Karnak in November, he sketched them from various angles, ultimately producing several lithographs of the main axis, the transverse view, and exterior views, with some columns askance appearing ready to fall. Fabio Bourbon has described Robert's second visit to Karnak. Quote, Robert spent 4 days at Karnak, working feverishly, as if obsessed by the idea that he would be unable to do justice to the magnificence of what was once the earthly dwelling of Amun, Lord of the gods. He rose at dawn, and braving the heat and the tiresome bites of the ever-present mosquitoes, continued drawing and taking measurements until twilight. Then he took a well-deserved rest, unquote. Executing his final Karnak drawings on November 30th, Roberts returned to the Temple of Luxor to make more detailed sketches there. And then he crossed the Nile to visit the Valley of the Kings, December 3rd, making drawings of the Colossi of Memnon on the 4th, the Ramesseum on the 5th, these are what we looked at a moment ago, and the Temple of Dendar on the 6th. If we return to Robert's initial October travel southward up the Nile, we learn from his journal that following his first departure from Karnak, he visited Esna for a few hours on the 24th and Edfu on the 26th, both very significant Ptolemaic temples. Bourbon dates his picture of the Temple of Esna on his return trip November 25th. That's on the left side. The picture shows that the accumulation of rubbish and silt was so extensive in front of the temple at Esna that in Robert's day, one descends staircases to enter down below. You can see the staircase at the end of what's substantially dug out to the floor level of the temple. And the town is higher up, covering, but the sand in Robert's day was covering the base and the lower shafts of the columns. Indeed, Roberts recorded that he found the temple covered with the houses of the town as well. Moreover, the temple was being used as a powder magazine, leaving the walls black throughout, covered with the usual deities. His lithographs show the highest level of interior sand floor, and even today the extensive digging involved in reestablishing the original floor level is clear as one approaches the temple from the town's streets. And you have to, on this right-hand view, that you can see at the top right-hand corner is the town's level, and you go down that long flight of steps to get to the original level of the temple, some 30 feet below. And if you go around to the back of the whole complex, you can see the town level is literally cutting the temple in half. The Temple of Esna is rich in interior ornamentation, about which Roberts recorded little due to less than ideal lighting during his own visit. He wrote, quote, "The pillars are large and of the lotus form, but from the care we had to take of our light, it was nigh to impossible to see anything." His sketches, however, allowed an accurate rendering of the details of the capital, and I could observe in December 2023, probably better in a way than he could. Historian Fabio Bourbon rightfully concludes the uniqueness of the Temple of Esna lies in the fact that it is entirely covered with reliefs. The walls, the ceilings, the columns are decorated with religious texts covering an unusual variety of subjects. They recount the origin of the world, life and its transmission, the creation of man, and the theological basis of royal power. The most important parts were carved during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, the Roman emperors, while the most recent are attributed to Decius from AD 2050. So this is Ptolemaic era and constitutes the last known collection of hieroglyphic inscriptions. A second major Ptolemaic monument is the nearby temple of Edfu, to which from the river landing in a nearby village, Robert walked 5 miles in the hot desert to see on October 26th. He returned in November to spend 4 additional days drawing picturesque views, and in his journal entry of October 26th, he describes his first impression, quote, "On entering the village and winching our way through the wretched hovels by which it is blocked up, stood in front of the most beautiful temple in Egypt. High praise, indeed, from a man clearly possessed with an artist's eye. True," Roberts continued, "it is not of the magnitude of Karnak, nor is it in such preservation as Dendera, but it has all that these want. In every situation in which it is viewed, it is a picture. It has breadth of parts. The pillars are large, massy, and in form exquisite. Though half buried, it is more beautiful than if laid open, and reminds me of the Piranesi etchings of the Forum of Rome. The facade or portico of the Pronaos is the most exquisite in form I have ever seen, and every capital, being different, does not take its beauty, but in my opinion, takes from the beauty of the column, but enhances it." Edfu has been significantly dug out since Robert's visit, and I'm showing some black lines on these images to show how high the sand was in Robert's day. Sand and debris piled higher and higher through the years, and Robert's drawings suggest that sand not only filled the court, but had accumulated nearly to the height of the capitals inside the temple. Roberts struggled through 98 degrees Fahrenheit degrees to make his drawings, and he was especially captivated by the variety of capitals, not least because the rest of the columns were under sand. In the courtyard beyond the pylons, the 32 columns each had a different capital, and in the magnificent pronaos, the 2 flanking the portals were shaped like lotus flowers. The middle capitals each side are ornamented with date palm leaves, and the outer capitals were inspired by the fronds of Hyphanae Trebeckia, a palm tree typical of the region. The artist positioned figures in vignettes near the carved coping and capitals, not only drawing attention to the scale of this monument, but also afforded the opportunity to depict in detail the intricate incisions and profiles and sculptural enrichments of the capitals themselves. One of the most dramatic images is looking back across the court to the pylon gate with a colonnade surrounding the courtyard, all depicted by Roberts from high above the accumulated sand, the whole framed by massive columns with their noble and, using Roberts' work, exquisite capitals. Edfu was dedicated to the falcon god of the sky, Horus, the avenging son of Isis, goddess of the moon and of healing, and the first queen of Egypt, and her husband and also sibling. This was a strange thing. She was married to him, but they were siblings. Osiris, the god of the afterlife. They were considered the male and female forces of the universe. The myth of Osiris centers on the conflict for 80 years between Horus and Seth, the god of war and chaos. Seth was a brother of Osiris and Isis, and thus Horus's uncle. According to the Egyptian myth, Seth murdered Osiris in order to steal the throne of Egypt. To decide the rightful heir, the Kinniab, the Council of 9 gods, decided the two should battle it out in a series of trials. In one battle, Horus lost his eye, which was restored perhaps by Hathor, the goddess of the sky, fertility, and beauty. Horus's right eye, the sun, and left eye, the moon, gave him dominion over all of the heavens. The restored sacred eye became a symbol of protection sacrifice, healing, regeneration, and royal power. So I was looking around for the Horus eye on these temples, and there it is. The four figures up here on the left side are Hathor, Seth, Isis, and Horus, with a sacred eye above. And I suspect the Egyptian pyramid and the eye on the back of our $1 bill may be related in some way by way of Freemasonry. At Edfu, the reliefs on the pylons, by the way, represent Ptolemy III, who began the temple's construction in 237 BC, battling victoriously over his enemies while Horus and Hathor look on. The temple was not excavated until a quarter century after Robert's expedition, so he saw it buried in sand. In the 1860s, Auguste Mariette, the first director of antiquities, began digging out the temple and removing the wattle and daub huts and intrusive houses that had encroached into the temple precinct, including on the roofs of the hypostyle hall. Ironically, the sand had helped preserve the temple for 2,000 years. And you can see the difference. The photograph there, I've also put a sand level line to show how high the sand was in Robert's day. And just outside the pylons is a birth house, Mamisi, whose capitals depict the dwarf god Bes, and whose wall paintings reliefs include Hathor holding the child Horus with the creator god seated at the right. And deep within the temple itself is the Holy of Holies, like most of the temple interiors, unseen by Roberts. Within this deep sanctuary is a copy of the sacred bark of Horus. The original is in the Louvre in Paris, one of the museum's many acquisitions resulting from the fact that the first director of antiquities of Egypt was French, Auguste Mariette. Well, that may, for some of you, happily bring us to the intermission. So we can now take a moment and stretch our feet and wander about a bit, and we'll take a breather, and we'll continue in a short bit. David Roberts first saw the island of Philae on October 30th after passing the first cataract of the Nile by donkey and en route to where they, quote, thought they were most likely to find the steamer line to continue their journey on the Nile. After riding for some time near the banks of the Nile, he recorded, "We suddenly came in sight of the little island of Philae, a paradise in the midst of desolation. Its ruins, even at a distance, were more picturesque than any I have seen," unquote. And while his attendants busied themselves with the laborious task of hauling their two boats across the rapids, the boats were unloaded and then rowed up by about 60 men of all ages and sizes, and as Roberts recorded, accompanied by great shouting and bawling, which appeared indispensable here, they safely towed us through with the great difficulty. He began to sketch Philae in this general view on October 30th, and the so-called Pharaoh's Bed, Roman kiosk, which had actually been built by Trajan in the 1st century, almost into the 2nd century AD, and that I illustrated earlier in the talk. Roberts recorded that the whole of the intermediate space that is not covered with the remains of the temple is strewn with the debris of the former town. This seems to have happened in so many of these sites, encumbered with the ruins of mud huts, with which every part of it has been covered, even to the roofs of the temples, and through which we scrambled our way with some difficulty to a square temple on the south of the island, which is the Trajan. And in his sketches, Roberts appears to remove from view this encroaching debris, as he wanted to focus on the remarkably preserved ancient architecture itself. Referencing the lotus-formed capitals, Roberts writes, "The whole is as if the masons and carvers had but just left their employment. It is of a light sandstone and so sharp and beautiful in the detail that I could scarcely imagine that I was looking at a ruin that was 2,000 years standing." Then, on entering the great temple, Roberts recorded, "I was astonished and delighted with the elegant proportions, and as he had at Karnak the week before, he resolved to create monumental views of this noble temple and its columns on his return trip north, which would follow 2 weeks later." His mid-November drawings were meticulous in detail, showing preserved color that unfortunately has further deteriorated since, as you can see with my photographs, in which most of that color here is gone. The forms of the capitals and the intricacy of the column incisions remains, but the temple site has experienced threatening forces of nature, moisture throughout due to flooding. Indeed, the noble conservation efforts since Robert's day make the present day preservation of the site one of the miracles of modern technology. Both David Roberts and I, albeit separated by 185 years, visited the island of Philae by boat and toured the Trajan kiosk, the great Ptolemaic pylons, and the Temple of Isis at Philae after the seasonal akhet, or inundation of the Nile, which occurs usually between June and September. The monsoon season in the Ethiopian highlands yearly fed rivers and tributaries that flowed into and essentially formed the Nile south of Aswan. And as the river flowed south to north into the Mediterranean Sea, the annual summer inundation affected Egyptian agriculture along the fertile Nile River and indeed shaped the entire culture. The god of the Nile Hapi is depicted with a fat belly indicating fertility and often carries offerings of food and drink. The thin strip of the Nile, flanked by desert, was and is the lifeblood of Egypt. When the river overflowed its banks, it left a rich soil along its banks for cultivation, but Egypt is 96% desert. When the inundation was extensive and when it was mild, fields of crops were either underwater or parched. The annual inundation also flooded the temple sites along the Nile or on low islands on the river, such as at Philae. Robert's November 18th view from the south of the Temple of Isis on Philae at the right appears to show in the foreground floodwaters having receded. The views at left, however, indicate the high water from the summer floods above the floor level of the temple itself. When the lower dam at Aswan was constructed in 1902, floods nearby, including at Philae, were even worse. Philae found itself in the reservoir of the lower dam. 72 years after Robert's expedition, visitors to the Temple of Isis at Philae would have to row their boats right into the temple, as these two paintings of 1910 and an earlier postcard above show. Moreover, the lower dam height was raised twice from 1907 to 1912 and again from 1929 to 1930. The constant changing of that lower Aswan dam just made these floods worse and worse in this site. Philae was then always underwater, except when the sluices of the dam were opened from July to October, that is, during the season of akhet. The water then receded to disclose mud-covered columns as an aberration, wrote Fabien Bourbon. So how is it possible, seen in the views at the bottom of the screen, that 21st century visitors are walking on dry land near the same portal as viewed at the top left, or within the dry court as shown at the right? What today's visitors likely do not know is that between 1972 and 1980, the entire complex of Philae was dismantled, stone by stone, and re-erected on a nearby island on higher ground. It was described as the greatest archaeological rescue campaign of all time. The temple complex historically on the island of Philae is now on the nearby island of Agilkia. Waters most certainly continue to rise annually, but no longer flood the Isis complex. One of Robert's final drawings before he left Philae on November 19, 1838, was prophetically a view of the island at sunset. He could not have known of the subsequent history of the Philae complex, as remarkable as it was. After suffering decades of seasonal flooding, exacerbated by the Aswan Lower Dam, in 1960, UNESCO sponsored its campaign to save the Nubian monuments, ultimately conducting 40 archaeological projects and rescuing 22 monuments along the Nile. Work began at Philae in 1972 and has been described by Fabio Bourbon. Pile-driving boats began to drive 3,000 steel piles into the bottom of the reservoir. These piles enclosed the land in two concentric dams that were to form the base of a mighty ring-shaped dam, that is a watertight caisson. The water was then pumped out of and the mud removed by hundreds of workmen. You can see the mud all through the complex at the bottom of that screen. In the meantime, the ground was leveled at Akilkia by 100 feet, and the coastline was extended. The Philae temple was graphed with delineating blocks numbered, and 37,363 blocks were then moved piece by piece and piled up and stored for a moment, and then moved ultimately to be reconstructed on the other island. On March 29th, workmen began to reassemble the stones on Agilkia. The new Philae complex opened March 10th, 1980. As Bourbon wrote in 1996, and I observed 27 years later, the only remaining signs of the long decades during which the complex was underwater is the grayish color of the lower parts of the structures. And I put a line at the sort of top of the stain so that you note that. And I might add as well, when you go in the temple, the incised reliefs on the walls are also sort of muddy gray here because they were underwater for so long. From Philae, Roberts continued south, crossing the Tropic of Cancer, heading for Abu Simbel. Night was falling on November 8, 1838, when Roberts first saw on the horizon the monument of Abu Simbel, the southernmost site of his itinerary. The next morning, at dawn, he stood before the two temples of colossal figures of Ramses II and Queen Nefertari. The site had been discovered only 25 years earlier, in 1813, by a Swiss explorer, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. The whole was virtually covered in sand, and the entry to the temples were blocked. The entry was blocked. The Englishman William John Banks and the Italian Giovanni Fanati were able to access the smaller temple in 1815, but too much sand blocked the larger Ramses temple. You can see it a little higher up the hill in that painting. The head and shoulders of one of the colossi of Ramses was visible, but the rest was buried. Egyptologist Giovanni Battista Belzoni, and this is a color plate from his publication, Plates from the Research and Operations in Egypt and Nubia from 1820. Belzoni had spent more than a month in 1817 sifting away sand, at least to get access to the entry to the larger temple. And when Roberts arrived 2 decades later, most of the temple facade remained hidden under sand. That's one of the earliest photographs of the site on the top right, and you can see it's still substantially covered with sand. Nonetheless, Roberts recorded what he found in the view from the river, and with his typical attention to detail. The earliest photograph is by John Beasley Green, a French-born American. Well, by daybreak, November 9th, Roberts was in the celebrated temple. He describes the colossal figures, and by the way, the view, photograph on the left is of the figure number 3, which has the arrow above it. So it shows that it was at least up to the waist in sand, and I've drawn a line again where that sand was in Robert's day. Roberts described the colossal figures as, quote, on the face of the rock overhanging the river, with Ramses, the southernmost temple, laid open by the indefatigable Belzoni, the most extraordinary, but the sand here pours down from the desert behind, so much that the three figures forming the facade are much buried. There's actually four, one of them's pretty well damaged. Robert's closer drawing of the Ramses Colossi records the mound of sand and places figures in the drawing on the ledge at the right shoulder, which you can see there on the edge of the painting, in order to provide some scale. And also two figures near the shin of the damaged figure number 2, and two other figures in the shade of a nearby rock in the foreground. Commentators have since suggested that Robert drew these figures and vignettes at a smaller scale than the actual relative size in order to give the impression of an impressively largesse of the monuments more than it really was. But photographs from 2023 at left with scale figures below would suggest not. The colossi are indeed colossal. The facade of the great temple is 105 feet high and 125 feet wide, with the colossi measuring 65 feet high. That means these sculptures are the height of a 7-story skyscraper. In addition to the enthroned colossi of Ramses II, the facade features smaller figures of his mother Tuya, the wife of Pharaoh Seti I, Ramses' wife Nefertari, and their sons. In the left image, at the center of the pylon, backdrop and above the entry is Ra Horakti, you can see, wearing the solar disk, flanked by reliefs of Pharaoh making offerings to Ra. At the very top of the facade, a row of 22 baboons, 8 feet tall. That theme, by the way, is inside King Tut's tomb as well. They're baboons painted on the end wall of that burial chamber. Were intended to be 24, representing the 24 hours of the day, but there appear to be 22 of them there. The feature recalls to mind the one that we looked at earlier at King Tut's tomb. Below the enthroned Ramses colossi are statues of Horus, alternating with a pharaoh with crossed arms holding the scourge and crozier. The latter, a hooked staff later carried by Christian bishops as a sign of authority. On the face of the huge blocks beneath the feet of the colossi are hieroglyphics representing the pharaoh as a god and king of Upper and Lower Egypt. In Robert's day, most of the two colossi statues to the right of the entry were buried, and the blocks, the hieroglyphics, the Horus figures were under tons of sand. He would not have seen any of that, those last few views. Roberts records some basic descriptions of the Abu Simbel temple and Ramses colossi, but moves quickly to a diatribe lamenting the loss of or damage to parts of the sculpture due to souvenir hunters and graffiti. He writes, quote, "There are 4 colossal figures cut out of the face of the rock in a sitting position like the celebrated Memnons on the plain of Thebes. There is this difference, however. These are the most perfect condition, while those at Thebes are much mutilated. Their preservation is owing to their having been buried in the sand so long, accumulating around them, and it's almost to be wished that they were covered again," he says. And it is at this point that Roberts avoids all restraint by adding, "What with Cockney tourists and Yankee travelers, they stand every chance of being in a few years in a worse state. Is it not shocking to see these glorious specimens of art, the most ancient in the world, not only destroyed by relic hunters, but carved with such names as Tompkins and Smith and Hopkins," unquote. Well, Roberts continued his harangue, lambasting souvenir hunters. Quote, "The hand of the best preserved figures is completely destroyed, nothing being so delightful to these vermin as a finger or a thumb or the great toe of a statue. And after committing such depredations, they have the effrontery to smear their stupid names on every forehead of the god." Well, one would wonder what Roberts would think of modern-day graffiti splashed across contemporary urbanscapes, or inscriptions like "Kilroy was here" on the World War II monument in Washington, D.C., or what he thought of his lithographer in London, who added Robert's name on the base of one of Ramsay's legs when Robert's drawings were cut into stone for lithographic portfolios. You can see that spelled out in detail at the very bottom, but it's under that, it's on that foot. Well, thanks to partial excavations of Belzoni, 11 years prior to Robert's expedition, the entry to the great temples of Abu Simbel was open and the interior accessible, although again, the colossal statues of Ramses inside the temple were buried in sand up to the upper thigh. Again, Roberts provides his own written description in his journal entry of November 9th. Quote, on descending into the splendid hall, for the sand is almost to the top of the doorway, a double row of colossal figures attached to square pillars support the roof. By contrast, there was no sand when I entered the temple in 2023. It was broom clean. Roberts continued, the placid expression of these is rather superior to those on the exterior. There are 4 on each side, and each of the 4 figures with arms crossed and holding the scourge and crozier. Those on the right have the high conical cap, and those on the left what is termed the corn measure, unquote. Noted also by Roberts were the incised wall reliefs. He records that the walls and pillars are covered with the most interesting sculpture and excellent preservation. Battle scenes predominated, depicting Ramses victorious over his enemies and celebrating the Battle of Kadesh. Roberts also observed the ceiling writing. The roof, he writes, is also in the most unusual style with the sacred falcon holding 2 feathers. Located some 213 feet deep into the rock is what Bourbon refers to as the sacrarium, the most remote and secret part of the temple. The room is about 13 feet wide by 23 feet deep, with a rock-cut altar and a stone bench with 4 seated figures. Left to right, they are Ptah, Amun-Ra, Ramses II, and Ra-Horukti. Ra, one of the oldest deities of ancient Egypt, merged with Horus to become the morning sun, Ra-Horukti. Amun is the noonday sun and the god of Luxor, where Ramses made major additions to the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and Ptah was the god of darkness and death. The east-west alignment of the great temple of Abu Simbel is such that on February 21st, Ramses' coronation day, and October 21st, Ramses' birthday, yearly, the rising sun penetrates the temple hall, reaches 200 and some feet deep into the sacrarium and the 4-seated statues. Slowly and in turn, the light strikes Ra-Horukti, then Ramses, then Amun, but never reaches Ptah, the god of darkness. The dates of this phenomena are equidistant from the winter solstice, 61 days before and 61 days after. The Sun Festival continues to be celebrated today, attracting crowds gathering outside the temple before sunrise. Aligned inside the sequence of chambers, tourists stand 2 people deep on either side of the aisle to let the sun through, and the flanking walls allowing it to penetrate deep to the interior and the axis. The smaller temple to the north of Abu Simbel, the site is at the top right. You can see a view of how far away they are. Is dedicated to the goddess Hathor and Ramses' wife Nefertari. On the facade, in niches between the sloping piers, are colossal statues, 4 of Ramses II and 2 of Nefertari. Across the facade, left to right, are Ramses, Nefertari, Ramses, Nefertari, Ramses. Flanking the entry door, the left figure of Ramses wears the white crown of Lower Egypt, while the right colossus wears the double crown symbolizing the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. Unheard of was the creation of colossal figures of the pharaoh's wife, representing as large as the pharaoh. This is done nowhere in Egypt, but she is as large as he is on these. The smaller figures on either side of the Colossi legs are Ramses' sons next to him and daughters next to Nefertari. The minor temple is not cut as deeply into the rock as was Ramses' great temple. Beyond the front wall of Colossi, one passes through a small porch entry into a large hall with 6 piers forming what later might be called the nave and side aisles. The west wall is broken by 3 openings to a cross vestibule with small chambers on each side and a sanctuary terminating the temple's main east-west axis. The piers have reliefs of Egyptian gods, of Ramses, and of Nefertari on 3 sides, and facing inward in the inner nave of the hall, the pier surfaces are covered with hieroglyphs, with each pier crowned on the interface with the head of Hathor with her distinctive cow's ears. I don't know why she's given cow's ears, but there she is. Walls feature painted reliefs of the crowning of Ramses by Horus, the god of kingship and protection, power, and the sun, and the crowning of Nefertari by Hathor, the goddess of beauty, among other attributes. Other wall reliefs show Ramses' military victories, such as the representation on the inside front wall of Ramses smiting an Asian prisoner with a mace, while Horus, here symbolizing power and victory, at right hands the king a victory dagger, and at left Queen Nefertari watches. Beyond the large hall is a cross axis with wall paintings depicting Nefertari and Ramses' offerings of percussion instruments and papyrus, and Hathor, let me go back to that, the goddess of the sky, of women, fertility and love, and sensuality, music and dancing. The crowning of Nefertari, which was viewed earlier, is on the south wall facing west. And finally, one comes to the small sanctuary and the west end of the main axis, where sculpture and wall reliefs, in fact, have been more damaged than they were in the main temple. Abu Simbel was the furthest south that both David Roberts and I ventured before we both turned back to return to Cairo. The southern border of Egypt at Sudan is just 12 miles away. This is not quite the end of the story, however. The postscript recognizes that the Ramses II and Nefertari temples that Roberts painted were the same as I visited 185 years later, but not quite in the same location. Many in this audience will have heard of the Aswan Dam, but may not know that is the high dam, but may not know the specifics of its construction, its intended and actual effects, and particularly its impact on Abu Simbel. Attempts to control the flooding of the Nile date back to the 11th century. And the Arab Alhazen was summoned to Egypt by the Caliph to regulate the flooding of the Nile, and concluded that it was impractical to try to do so. Then between 1898 and 1902, the British, for the same purpose, built the Aswan Low Dam. Early images romanticized the setting, and indeed the low dam was kept low due to concerns that the flooding of the Temple of Isis on Philae Island, already adversely affected by the inundations, would experience even higher flooding. But as we saw earlier, it did, and they continued to raise the dam. 5 years after the low dam was opened, when monsoon summers rains from Ethiopia poured even more water from the unusual highland tributary, the dam's height was raised again, and as earlier mentioned, both in 1907 and 1929 and 34, they kept raising that lower dam. In 1946, the low dam almost overtopped, but rather than enlarging it a third time, officials initiated plans about 1952 to develop an entirely new dam 4 miles upstream. In June 1956, the Soviet Union offered a $1.12 billion loan to construct the Aswan High Dam, and the rock and clay construction of one of the world's largest embankment dams began in January 1960. The High Dam was designed by Alexandrovich Malyshev of the Moscow-based Hydro Project Institute. It created a huge reservoir and a huge space known as Lake Nasser in Egypt, and the southern third in Sudan, named Lake Nubia. Khrushchev called this the eighth wonder of the world. By 1964, the first stage of the construction of the high dam was completed and the reservoir started filling. The rising waters promised to drown Abu Simbel, flooding both temples entirely and placing them totally underwater in this, as this model shows. Again, a dark line showing the water level. That's the original location of these two temples. The solution was to raise the entire two-temple rock-cut complex, a task of prodigious ambition. The black lines superimposed on these photographs of the temple on their original sites indicates the expected water levels after the high dam was completed. A fundraising campaign to save the Abu Simbel temples began, and between 1964 and 1968, the entire temple site was cut up into blocks of stone averaging 20 tons each, some as high as 30 tons or 60,000 pounds. Preliminary precautions included constructing a steel wall and sand bunker against the rising river levels, and ironically, they considered the Colossus condition should be buried in sand when David Roberts, as he saw them in 38, covering the entire temple front with sand to protect the colossal figures from damage at the top of the rock cliff, because they had to remove the top of the cliff. Then the facade, colossi, interior temple walls, and sanctuary spaces deep within the rock were dismantled and reassembled. The rescue plan was initiated by UNESCO, which at the time was only 14 years old, who gathered together architects and engineers and archaeologists and hydrologists to plan and oversee the moving of the monuments. Time was short because the dam was already built and the waters were rising as they were trying to take this thing apart to create the new Lake Nasser. And the cut-up blocks were numbered, moved to storage, reassembled 210 feet above the old site and 590 feet inland. Both temples, and this is seeing the smaller temple, were treated in the same way. Behind a new artificial cliff, engineers built a sheltering dome that over the Ramses temple was 75 feet high and 213 feet in diameter and was the largest concrete dome in the world, under which the deep Great Temple complex of Ramses II was to be resited. The design of the dome was intended to protect the temples from a 10-point Richter scale earthquake. The reassembled temples of Abu Simbel were inaugurated in their new location on September 22nd, 1968. And in the Aswan Museum, there is a model showing in the lower section we looked at earlier the relationship of the new siting of the reservoir water level and the original site of the temples now underwater. The Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970, and the reservoir it formed, which is called Lake Nasser, reached its full capacity in 1976. The Aswan High Dam is 364 feet high, 2 1/3 miles long, and almost 2/3 of a mile wide. It's all earthen. While its construction was a major effort in and of itself, the removal and reassembling of the temples of Abu Simbel was a challenge worthy of Hercules. Its new site conveys a quality of majesty and monumental achievement worthy of its original builders. Benefiting Egypt as a new power source, the high dam also provides flood control of the Nile, which has added agricultural acreage, but there is a downside. New dam and reservoir required the relocation of some 100,000 residents, putting the old town of Wadi Halfa, located in the Sudan 44 miles south of Abu Simbel, completely underwater, just to cite one example. The whole town is underwater. And this is a photograph of the Wadi Halfa railroad station, which is now submerged in Lake Nasser. For centuries, the annual inundation of the Nile brought natural nutrients and minerals annually to the river valley, enriching the soil along the floodplain and especially the delta, where, of course, we all know about the delta of Egypt. That's where Mike Lindell, the CEO of My Pillow, keeps telling us is the best cotton grown anywhere in the world. Only in the region between the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean, and the Nile River, he says incessantly on television. But it was true. Did I leave him off there? There he is. But it is true that since ancient times, the Nile River has been ideal for farming, however close the desert may border the river. And however low water years could bring drought and famine, the high water could destroy an entire crop cycle. The Aswan High Dam, while controlling flood levels, is also trapping as sediment the estimated 110 tons of silt that was previously carried northward along the Nile Valley to the delta, enriching the agricultural lands. Now farmlands have to be fertilized artificially. And in the delta, where the river meets the Mediterranean Sea, salt water intrudes. It is estimated that the Aswan High Dam's reservoir lifespan may be as little as 200 years due to the filling of the lake with trapped sediment. That is just over a decade more than the time span separating David Roberts' expedition and my own. David Roberts' visit of several days to Abu Simbel, as did mine, drew to a close with a near disaster with respect to the documentation of our respective Egyptian expeditions. Roberts worked his way back to Cairo, having executed over 100 sketches in his portfolio. I returned to Atlanta with several thousand digital images on my camera. On December 11, 1838, Roberts realized that he had left his Nubian sketchbook on a cliff edge somewhere out in the field. On December 17, 2023, when I arrived home in Atlanta, I realized I'd left my camera in the bathroom of the British Air flight from Cairo. That was closer to paralleling David Roberts' expedition that I intended or wanted to experience. Roberts sent his servant back to the last sketching site, and 2 days later he returned, having recovered Roberts' sketchbook. In order to maintain historical alignment, British Air took 3 days to find my camera, although I told them exactly where it was. Perhaps the camera wanted a couple more round trips back to the Nile. At the conclusion of the Egyptian phase of his expedition, Roberts wrote, quote, "The voyage has been, on the whole, a very pleasant one, and certainly by far the most interesting I have ever taken. My drawings, I feel, are not only good, but of the greatest interest, independent of their being mere pictures. I am the first artist, at least from England, that has yet been here, and there is much in this. The French work I now find conveys no idea of these splendid remains." We have to remember that Napoleon, in his Egyptian campaign, had been to Egypt before Roberts and had, as a sort of second wave, a whole group of scientists and various other people recording all kinds of things. But then Roberts adds, "Subjects of another class equally remain yet in Cairo, and equally untrodden ground. If God spares my health, I think there is much may be made of the splendid mosques, the tombs of the Mamelukes and the caliphs." So Roberts spent 6 weeks in Cairo preparing for the second phase of his expedition to Syria and the Holy Land. He was well aware that no Christian was allowed to enter mosques at all. He wrote, quote, "The day, and not long since, that a Christian life would have been forfeited for visiting them," unquote. However, Roberts' object is to get at these remains of a bygone age, all now fast hastening to decay, and they may soon be in total ruin. So when he visited the consul in Cairo on January 2nd, he was informed that in order to visit the various mosques, let alone make drawings, I must assume Turkish dress. He also divested himself of his whiskers, commenting, "This is too bad, but I have taken too long a journey to stand now about trifles. I think after all I shall be the first professional man who has sat down to make a drawing, and we shall see how I get on." He then added whimsically, "What would my friends in England say to see me masquerading in this uniform? But after all, my object can be accomplished in no other way. My dress fits me capably, and my servant informs me I become the dress well. But he is such a thorough rogue, I can't believe him in anything." So Roberts remains in Cairo during January, completing his portfolio of drawings of the mosques and sites of the city and finalizing arrangements for the second phase of his expedition. He then spent February through mid-May touring the Holy Land, returned to Alexandria, and then set off for home, although he was delayed by being quarantined 3 weeks in Malta, but finally arrived back in London on July 21st, 1839, having been away for 11 months. He brought back an estimated 272 detailed drawings and sketchbooks filled with smaller drawings of Egypt, Nubia, Palestine, and Syria. From these, Lewis Haig transferred scenes to 247 lithographs. William Peck has made the following observation, quote, "The mathematics of this project are simple. Roberts made almost 300 drawings in approximately 330 days, plus a panorama of Cairo and 3 full sketchbooks, a massive output for any draftsman. When a reasonable amount of time is deducted for the vagaries of travel in remote countries in the early 19th century, indisposition or illness, as well as the preparation necessary for the actual working of recording the monuments, it almost defies the imagination to explain Roberts' enormous productivity." But we must leave David Roberts in Cairo at the end of the Egyptian phase of his expedition. It is the afternoon of February 7th, 1839, and David Roberts, dressed as a Turk, has left Cairo and is encamped in a tent in the desert with eyes scanning the eastern horizon. His expedition of the Holy Land has just begun, but that is another story. Thank you. We made it on time. Ken.